Hi there. Glad to be back with you. I want to look at something really quickly in the scriptures then. We're going to look at one of the shortest Psalms. It's Psalm 70. I'm going to read it to you here. Psalm 70, and it's only 5 verses. Hasten, O God, to save me. O Lord, come quickly to help me. May those who seek my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace. May those who say to me, Aha, aha, turn back because of their shame. May all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation always say, Let God be exalted. Yet I am poor and needy. Come quickly to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer, O Lord. Do not delay. And that's the entire psalm. It's written by King David. And it invites us into this weird thing that we don't do very much. It's called lament. And lament is all throughout the scriptures. And we see lots of the prophets doing it. We see David writing over and over and over all these psalms that simply cry out to the Lord with some level of pain, whether he's in physical danger, whether his heart is hard, whether he himself has sinned and is crying out to God for mercy. We see Jesus doing this. When he sits in the Garden of Gethsemane and he actually is on his knees and he cries out and he said, Lord, take this cup from me. Take this cup of suffering that I'm about to drink for all of humanity from me, but not what I want, but what you want. And so we have this model all the way through the scriptures of people crying out to the Lord for help. And it's not like subtle crying out. Some of it's violent. Some of it's heart-wrenching. And we read it and we're kind of like, okay, that was a different time. But maybe we're not comfortable with that kind of a relationship with the Lord, where you go to him in the darkest times and you simply pour your heart out. And sometimes it's beautiful and it's worshipful, but other times it's awful. Some of the things David prays and sings to the Lord and communicates in the Psalms are disgusting. They're violent. I'm sure you've come across passages in the scriptures where you're like, well, how is this in the Bible? And the reason that it's in the Bible is because one of the things that David especially teaches us to do in the Psalms is to take what's in here and all of what's in here, not just the pretty stuff, not just the easily understood stuff, the confusing things, the painful things, the heartache, and pour it out to the Lord. And he says, you rescue me. And in the Psalms, you can see him, what he's doing is he's saying, not just you rescue me from that thing that's out there, but rescue me from hatred, rescue me from a hard heart, rescue me from closing off and just dealing with it on my own. And sometimes when David's saying, rescue me from these people who are trying to murder me, he's the king. And at that point in history, the king had complete authority and he could have gone himself and murdered everybody who was going to threaten him. But he doesn't. Instead, he says, God, save me from my heart, from my own heart as well as what's out there. And you see this incredible thing happen. Is most of these Psalms where David is complaining, where David is saying, may those who seek my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace, like we just read. You see this turn. You see this, and often it's the word but. And you just see him crying out to the Lord. And then there's this but. And he moves from rage, from fear, from all these things that are just been pouring out to the Lord. And you see him move into worship. And often it's a jarring transition. Often it's jarring. It's just like, where did this come from? And yet what happens in that moment is he has an encounter with God. God shows up. God arrives in some way and touches him and changes him and gives him what the New Testament calls a peace which is outside of our understanding, which simply says that my presence, God comes to him and says, my presence is what you need. And God provides that. And you see this incredible thing happen, and David immediately turns and he's off into worship. There's this So I encourage you to do this with the Lord, because there's this incredible thing that happens When we simply go to God and say, God, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm angry at, and I'm not worried about whether I'm right or not. I assume I'm right because I'm angry. But I'm not worried about whether I say it in the right way. I'm not worried about whether I'm violent in my thoughts, or upset, or grieving, or frustrated, or defeated, or depressed. But I simply say, God, this is how I'm doing. Realistically, I'm in a lot of danger. Realistically, I'm closed off and I don't know how to wake my heart up. Realistically, I want this thing that I know I'm not supposed to have. Realistically, I know I'm supposed to do this other thing, and I refuse. But God, by bringing it to you, I give you the opportunity to infiltrate our relationship and to change me. And like King David experienced, when he got to the end of his own self, when he got to the end of his cries for vengeance, when he got to the end of his weeping, God shows up. And there's this moment where it all turns. There's this moment when God shows up and his presence answers the question that no rational answer can provide. His presence changes us. And so in the midst of this quarantine, in the midst of this national crisis, in the midst of this international disaster, cry out to the Lord. That's not an expression. That's not just a phrase that we use. Make it literal and go to God and say, this is really how all of me is doing. And when you bring all of who you are to all of who God is, you will be transformed. May God bless you and meet with you in those rocky places.